Hey everyone, I am Pranav, and I'm going to be walking through this presentation and this webinar over the next few minutes. But I wanted to start with just a couple of housekeeping items. So obviously, I don't see your faces, and what I would say is, if you are liking something, give it a thumbs up. If I ask you a question, react with the reactions on Zoom and help me understand sort of what's resonating, what's not resonating. And that would be fantastic. And as Paolo mentioned, please put in your questions in the Q&A box. We're going to try and take those live as much as possible, or we'll do some of those at the end if the subject of the question is a little bit different from the topic we're talking about. Okay. So let's go ahead, and I am going to share my screen here. Get into it. Okay. So we're going to talk about marketing measurement today. And the reason I think this is an interesting topic is, many of you would have seen this quote in the past. If you've spent time in growth and in marketing, I'm pretty sure you've seen this, right? Half the money I spend on advertising is wasted. The trouble is I don't know which half. Now, this quote it is attributed to this guy, John Wanamaker, from I think the early 1900s, or yeah, 1900s is probably about right. And he's been credited as the person who invented the idea of a supermarket or a department store, and also been credited with kind of creating modern advertising, where he would go in and put an ad in the newspaper to drive more traffic to the department store. And so it's very apt coming from that person. Now, what's really interesting to me as a practitioner is that you fast forward 125 years and you're still in the same boat, where a lot of people have this perception that it's very difficult to know which part of your advertising or marketing or growth efforts are working versus not. So what's better to spend the next 30 minutes than talking about this concept? Okay, now here's another interesting quote, right? We come across this all the time, and I think this is at the heart of the problem with marketing measurement. Not everything that can be measured matters, and not everything that matters can be measured. And this is a riff on something that has been attributed to Albert Einstein and many other people. And it's the same sort of idea. What do you measure in marketing? And is it truly the thing that's going to drive your business outcomes? And then my favorite one, and then I promise I will get off of my quote box here. Um, Measurement is a bit like the weather. Everyone talks about it, but few really understand it. I don't know who said it, but it sounded funny, and I thought it was an apt use of our time here. Okay, so what I'm here to tell you that in the next 30 minutes, you're going to leave this webinar with practical, hands-on, and clear ways of understanding marketing measurement that you can take back to your marketing leaders, to your CFO, to your CEO. And anytime you get this question of like, hey, how do I measure the campaign that you just launched? You will have an answer. So I'm gonna, before I show you some of the materials of the content, I want to play this video, and I apologize, the sound might not come through to you. We were having some AV issues when we were testing this, but you do have the subtitles. So pay attention to the subtitles, and then I'll talk about who this individual is, and we'll talk about the concept of measurement. Okay, so this gentleman is Bill Masitas, who was the former CMO at Zendesk, at Slack. He was also the chief revenue officer at Slack. And previous to that, he ran marketing at Salesforce. He was an SVP there, and also spent time at IGN, which is the International Gaming Network, and also at Fox. So he's seen consumer, he's seen business, he's seen PLG. And if he is saying that, hey, you need to be able to measure this stuff, and we're way past the day or the time that you couldn't measure marketing, then you know that this is possible. And I've talked a lot with Bill about this in the last few months. So we'll talk about sort of how he looks at marketing measurement. Okay. So we're going on this mission, right? This mission impossible or mission possible. And every good mission needs an enemy. And I think the enemy, the villain in this story is really the word attribution. And I don't know if you agree or disagree with me here, but there's a meaning of the word attribution itself, right? It's cause and effect. And if you look up the meaning of the word attribution, that's what you're going to get. The reality is that over the last couple of decades, everything that people talk about as attribution, first click, last click, multi-touch, there is no semblance of cause or effect in those concepts. And that is why I call the word attribution the villain. The meaning of the word has been completely, um, you know, muddled up by folks in the last couple of decades that had, frankly, no clue about what they were doing. So um, we're going to talk about how you can do better than this attribution, first touch, last touch, multi-touch type of methodology. What your CFO and CEO and your CMO really care about is not really attribution. What they care about is the incremental impact from your marketing and sales activity, whether you're B2B or B2C. Um, this is what they're looking for. And if you take a step back and think about how you drive growth for the business, it's almost like a layer cake, right? You start with the organic demand in the market, right? Obviously, hopefully, you've built something as a business where there is demand for that product, for that service, for that technology. And if you've done a good job of it, you have some word of mouth, right? You have a happy customer, they tell other people. That's all sort of part of the core of building a product. Then you have this thing called brand equity. And think of this as the long-term impact of everything that your business does as brand equity, and gives you awareness and consideration and so on and so forth. And then you talk about marketing and sales. And so really what your CFO and CEO are thinking about is, if I layer on an additional dollar in marketing or an additional $5 in sales, what is that going to do in terms of incremental growth for the business beyond organic demand, beyond word of mouth, beyond brand equity? And you'll notice that none of this is about attribution, it's about incrementality. And that is a key part of the conversation we're going to have today. So we're going to go on 5 different missions over the next few minutes. And in each mission, we're going to talk about how do you measure search, social, email, podcast, and billboards. And you'll see a lot of commonalities in these in these sections. So the first thing to talk about is search ads. This is the number one thing that most people invest in when they are. Give me one second. I think I'm getting a chat. Okay. The search ads. This is the first thing that people are investing in when they're starting their growth efforts. And the real question that you have to ask yourself is, do these search ads drive incremental sales, or are they merely capturing the demand that's already in there? And the way to think about this is, what causes searches to even be done in the first place, right? You see a search, you have an impression, you have a click, you have a conversion. But the real question is, what is driving somebody to search in Google, in Bing, in other sort of search engines? And clearly that is not Google itself, right? Google's not causing the search to happen in the first place. It's merely the place where the search is happening. And to illustrate this point, this is a great little case study here that talks about a study from 2011 from eBay. And what eBay did is for all the branded search terms that included the word eBay in them, they literally just turned those search ads off. And guess what happened? Nothing. All of that traffic just transferred into their organic search um, funnel. And so this was a great initial study for both, eBay and also for a team of researchers at Berkeley who produced this study. And you can go, Google for it for this study, and you can kind of read it on your own time. They repeated this on Microsoft Search Network back then. Exact same thing happened. And so anytime you're doing search ads, my first sort of reaction to you all, recommendation would be to test the incrementality of your search efforts, especially if you're heavily focused on branded search. Now, here's the fun part. Google has noticed this, and they're not sort of silent about it. These are two screenshots from their YouTube feed. One that directly calls out this idea that cookie-based measurement continues to degrade. That's kind of the highlight that I'm sharing here. And to support testing like the one that we talked about in this previous slide, they've launched this feature called Conversion Lift. And it's essentially allowing you to run incrementality experiments directly in Google. And many folks have not really heard about this type of stuff in the past. So I would encourage you all to look at Conversion Lift in Google and give it a shot, both for branded and for non-branded search efforts. Okay. Second, social. I think social is one of those things that is least understood by marketers. And the reason I say that, or at least measurement is least understood for social and by marketers, because if you think about social advertising, it doesn't work the same way as search, right? There is no intent. You are not searching on Meta, on LinkedIn, on TikTok, on YouTube. Well, maybe you're searching a little bit on YouTube, but not the others. And so you're in a very different place when you are browsing these channels, and you may never click through an ad, but it might still influence your decision making. And guess what? The exact same thing is being said by Meta itself, right? So they are calling out, this is from 3 years ago. So Meta has been talking about this strategy for a while, that more than 90% of the people on Meta who would be buyers of your product are not actually clicking on your ads. And if you're only using cookie-based data, again, we're talking about Google Analytics or any of your JavaScript tags or first click, last click, all that fun stuff, that's not going to show up in your attribution. So what do? Here's a simple example. This works both for paid social and for organic social. If you are looking at the impressions of your social posts and you plot them over time, so on a daily basis, and then for the sake of this example, let's say you're running a B2B SaaS and you have demo as the core action on your website, and you map the volume of demos over the same time period. Now you can start to see the relationship between the impressions on social and your demo bookings. And the chart on the left shows, hey, your impressions going up and to the right, over the last 12 months, but your demos are not moving as much in that upward trajectory. Whereas the chart on the right is showing you that, hey, every time your impressions go up and down, that same trend is followed through on your demo bookings. And so you're probably seeing a very high impact from your social channels. So this is a very simple and easy way to understand the relationship between your marketing impressions on any given channel, especially on social, and your conversion funnel, the key metric that you're driving. So again, people talk about how this is hard to follow or hard to do to measure the impact of social advertising or even organic social. And I'm telling you, this is very much possible without fancy software, without any tools. You can literally get this data from your CRM, from your Meta, from your LinkedIn accounts directly. Okay, fantastic. So we talked about search, we talked about social. What about email, right? Everyone loves email. I think people call it sort of the OG of all channels and still very sort of useful and impactful in the business. But the real question is, do emails drive incremental sales? And said another way, like how many of you think, you're going to lose any sales or conversions if you stop doing all email tomorrow? And the answer obviously varies quite a bit. But here's the fun fact. You can actually test that. And email is the thing that you can test the most easily in all of your marketing channels. So this is known as a holdout test or an incrementality test, the same concept as we talked about in search and in social. But the difference is that whatever tool that you're using right now, whether it's Braze or Iterable or Marketo or HubSpot or Customer IO, almost all of them have the concept of doing a holdout test. And what you're doing in a holdout test is essentially randomly splitting your audience between a test and a control bucket. And you're only sending your email campaigns to the test bucket, and you're not sending any campaigns to the holdout bucket. And then you're monitoring conversions from both the holdout and the test bucket to see if you had any lift as a result of sending this test. Now, you can run this for any type of email campaign. You can do this for your welcome series. You can do this for your nurture campaigns. You can do this for your newsletter. And I highly encourage running these types of tests that allow you to understand the quantified incremental conversions that your various email campaigns are driving. So this one's the easiest because you don't have to rely on Google or on Meta or on LinkedIn for splitting the audience into different buckets for running this type of testing. And we'll talk a little bit about geo-testing in the next example as well. There are some questions that I'm seeing in the chat, so I'm just going to sort of talk about them here. But I would encourage you to also put them into the Q&A box. And Paolo, tell me if you're seeing any questions in the Q&A box. But one question that came in here is, what about the carryover effects of email, especially when dealing with longer sales cycles? That's a great question. And you have to think about what is the leading indicator of that eventual closed one, right? So in a B2B sales example, or even in a B2C example, when you have a high consideration purchase, right? So take the example of home purchases or luxury cars or luxury watches, anything that's it's a high consideration, high ticket item, you might have a longer sales cycle. And how do you look at the carryover effect of emails? What I typically recommend in that is having a permanent holdout. A permanent holdout means taking everything in your email database and looking at about 5% of those entries and putting them in a permanent holdout that you're not sending any email to. And you're then looking at the conversion rate of that holdout group over the period of 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, however long that you think your sales cycle is. And you can do this on an ongoing basis. You can do this on a once a year basis, but that's a good methodology to understand the carryover effects. You also want to look at the leading indicator of that eventual conversion. So in B2B, that might be somebody literally just booking a demo on your website. Because you're talking about email, you have the email address and you can see if they've booked a demo or not. And they may not lead to a conversion of a closed one or a contract signed, but you can still track if you're driving more demos as a result of your email marketing. That would be another example of looking at leading metrics for those longer sales cycles. Okay. Paolo, any questions that you see in the Q&A box?
Yeah, we do have some questions, and actually, let me start off with a question that has to do with email, since we're on this. So this came in just now. For the email test versus control groups, do you need a BI tool to quantify incrementality? They're just trying to understand how to connect the two groups, and how you would truly quantify incrementality.
Yeah, it's a great question. So your ESP, right? If you're using, you mentioned Iterable in the Q&A box. I'm going to go with that. You can configure your holdouts in Iterable directly. And so if you're not familiar with how to do that, obviously you need sort of an expert in Iterable, or your Iterable account rep can help you understand. And you're essentially looking at the unique ID of the user or the email address that you're going by, and you're putting those IDs into those test and control buckets. So you don't really need a BI tool to be able to do those types of incrementality tests within your email provider. And I'm assuming if you're using something like Iterable, you're also passing in your key conversion events back into Iterable. And so you can do all of that analysis directly within your ESP. You do not necessarily need a separate tool. Now, the devil's in the details. If you haven't set up the infrastructure to pass all of those conversion events back into Iterable, then yes, you do need to connect the two data sources together. And in that case, you're doing that outside of Iterable in whatever BI tool that your business is using.
Now, the other two questions we have are actually having to do with social from our last mission. Do you want to tackle those now?
Let's do it. So I think we talked a little bit about the time lag, right? And that's a good question. If you have an impression on day one, it doesn't mean that all your demo bookings are going to come on day one as well, right? There is a non-linear way of looking at things. Your demos might come in a few days later, a few weeks later. And so you actually can do some of that analysis in a spreadsheet if you really wanted to. And the way you would do that is by looking at a rolling average off those impressions and off of those demo bookings and look at either a weekly or a monthly sort of cohorted view. That's one way of doing it. The second way of doing this is to actually use something called marketing mix modeling, which is a much more sophisticated way of doing the same type of analysis, where the models themselves pick up the lag between an impression and a conversion. And for, I'm going to plug my course here. We are doing a course on marketing mix modeling, incrementality testing, and other sort of machine learning and AI tools in this space starting September 30th. So if you're interested in sort of learning more about the more sophisticated way of doing this, I would encourage you to sign up for that course. But for looking at sort of the specifics within your spreadsheets, you can actually do this on a weekly or a monthly basis and get a better sense of that lag effect between an impression and a down funnel conversion. Okay, so we talked about search, we talked about social, we talked about email. There's a lot of interest in podcasts and billboards. We're going to talk about those next as well. So how do you measure the impact of a podcast, right? A lot of people will put codes in their podcast advertising, right? And they'll say things like, hey, there'll be an ad read that says, if you're interested in HubSpot or if you're interested in Salesforce, go to HubSpot.com/reforge and sign up for a 20% off or what have you. And as all of us know, right, we're terrible in remembering those URLs or those codes. So most of the impact of podcasts doesn't even show up as a result of just humans having bad memory. And so whether you're doing your own podcast or you're doing podcast advertising, another way of looking at this is actually tracking your podcast impressions or your podcast listens and your conversion metrics. And you can do the same exact thing to find the correlation between the two, right? So in this example, I'm showing you a chart where you've basically plotted each point here represents a day, and that day is showing you the number of listens on that podcast or the podcast ad, and also the weekly demos for that week. And when you see this chart in this way, it's pretty obvious that you have a really good relationship, a really healthy relationship, a positive correlation between podcasts and your conversion metric. Now, if these dots were all over the map, right, there was no sort of pattern to it, they were spread randomly across the 2x2, then you know that there's no real relationship between those two things. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't do podcasts at the end of that. All I'm saying is that it's not really driving the conversion metric that you are looking at here. And again, the same question shows up, right? How do you account for the lag or the carryover effect? And there, the thing that you have to do is look at a weekly roll-up or a monthly roll-up, and that removes sort of the issue of having too much lag. And again, if you're getting really sophisticated and you're doing multiple channels, there are more sophisticated ways of doing this through machine learning. We'll talk about that in a course on September 30th. Okay. Now there's one other question from Curtis here. Um, Using different tools to measure different aspects of a customer journey often poses challenges, and that's a very good question. How do you tackle that? And what I typically say is, for a marketing organization or for a growth organization, you have to start with the metric that truly is in the control of the marketing or the growth team. And I'll take an example here. There's a lot of talk in business today about how sales and marketing is a team sport. And this is a very B2B specific example here, so I apologize. And we want to measure marketing through revenue rather than pipeline or leads or traffic. And I think it's a very dangerous way of going about it. And the reason I say that is, to your point, Curtis, there are so many things that are outside of marketing's control that impact that eventual close one revenue. And there's no meaningful way of measuring all of those different things. And you're going to have a situation where the marketing impact is completely, muddled up with all the other things that are happening in the funnel. So we think about picking a metric that is a true leading indicator of that closed won business. A good metric for B2B SaaS, hand raisers, people who are raising their hands and saying, I want to talk to sales, I want to do a trial, I want to see a demo, um, something that is explicit. And you can use that metric to understand if your marketing efforts are moving that metric up and to the right. And obviously, because you can see how those metrics are correlated eventually with closed won, you can do that exercise with your finance team to build a model around that. So that's how I would do it, Curtis. Very similar things on the B2C side, right? If you've got a multi-step funnel where somebody is signing up for a service and then 7 days later they have to convert from a trial to a purchase, or there's some other sort of KYC process involved if it's a fintech, you pick a metric that is a leading indicator and has predicted or is truly predictive of an eventual sort of financial metric. And you build your models and your correlations with that leading metric. Okay. Now, Aaron asks a really good question, and we're going to jump ahead a little bit here because he's asking about how do you do this when you have multiple channels, right? We talked a lot about examples where you've got search, you've got social, you've got podcasts, you've got billboards, you've got email, and you're looking at them in isolation. But what if you have 5 different channels running at the same time? Doesn't the picture get a lot harder? And it absolutely does. And jumping ahead a little bit, just to kind of talk about that concept, when you have multiple channels running at the same time, you are going to have a difficult time doing this in a spreadsheet. And so there are concepts like marketing mix modeling that allow you to find the correlations between each of those channels and your output metric. And in this example, I'm showing you, demos as the metric to train towards. And this is called a multilinear regression, which allows you to find the statistical relationship between each of those channels and your demo bookings. And think about it as like, answering a complicated formula where you're taking each of these variables, search, social, emails, podcasts, and billboards, and you're combining all of them to give you the demo output. And the machine learning models essentially go and solve this complicated formula for you in a way that allows you to understand the relative contribution from each of those channels. So that's how you tackle the question of when you have multiple channels running at the same time. But hopefully I've showed you in the last 20 minutes how you can go and collect the data across every single channel. And this can work for all types of marketing campaigns. And I'm going to bring it back to podcasts, right? So very notorious in marketing world where we talk about, hey, don't just go by billboards. How are you actually going to measure them? You're just lighting money on fire. The reality is far from it. Billboards absolutely can be measured. And I'm showing you an example here from a company called StatSig. They're actually an experimentation tool like an Optimizely or, I think there's another one called Epo and so on and so forth. And so they do testing within the product or within sort of product surfaces. And they launched this amazing set of billboards Some of them quite funny, right? We A/B tested this billboard against that one. This one lost. That's pretty funny. So how do they measure the impact of this? What you are doing to measure the impact of billboards is essentially launching them one geography at a time, or a few geographies at a time. And what that involves is looking at your demos or signups or traffic across your entire target market. So let's say it's the US, and you look at those on a DMA level or a state level or a city level or a zip code level. And then you look at where would you place that billboard in a few test markets, and you would compare it against your control markets to see if you are able to drive incremental signups or demos or traffic as a result of those billboards. And that's exactly what StatSig did. They launched this whole series of campaigns in SF, and they compared it against multiple other geographies to see if they were driving incremental signups for StatSig as a result. So whoever says podcasts can or billboards can't be measured is probably not familiar with this type of testing. And you absolutely can measure the impact of these offline channels. You just have to know how to do it. So Kamlesh is asking here, I'm going to answer this real time. Can you please name a couple of ML-based solutions for these multi-channel attribution methodologies? Yes, there are actually two open source methodologies that I'm going to talk about. Meta has released one called Robin, and you can just Google search for Meta Robin MMM, and you'll see that sort of open source package. The second is called Meridian from Google. They just launched it, they just announced it. I don't think that it's gone GA yet, but it's also open source, and it's based on machine learning that helps you understand the contribution of each of these channels towards your business metrics. So both of those are really solid starting points. They will require that you have in-house data science teams who are able to deploy those models, collect all the data, and then help your marketing teams kind of make sense of it. You also have solutions in the market. So I'm biased. I work for a company called Paramark. We do this. There are others like Recast, House. There are many others in the market that do both marketing mix modeling and incrementality testing. And so you've got a plethora of options from open source to vendors in the ecosystem who can help you understand the impact of every single marketing channel. And it's also expanding into outbound sales or owned channels like in-app messages and so on and so forth. Okay. I know we have 8 minutes left. So if you have more questions, I would highly encourage you to put them into the Q&A box. I do have this bonus section on brand, and I want to talk about this. It's interesting. In the field of marketing research, brand research, the most important thing to keep in mind is what people say and what people do can be very different. So here's an example. I don't know if you have heard of the Pew Research Institute. It's a think tank that looks at public policy, social dynamics, and what have you. They ran an online survey where they asked people on the internet if you're qualified to operate a nuclear submarine. And guess what? 12% of the audience said, yes, of course, we are qualified to operate a nuclear submarine. And we all know that the answer is closer to 0%, right? There aren't obviously people in the general population that are qualified to operate a nuclear submarine. So this example is a funny but very relevant reminder that surveys and survey-based methodologies to understand the impact of your brand can be quite problematic. And I would highly encourage everybody to really look at more tangible metrics when trying to understand the impact of your brand campaigns. And by tangible, I mean true sort of business metrics that are driving the top line or bottom line for your P&L. So one good example of doing this, and I talked about this with another marketer recently. This is a lagging metric, but if you just go look at the number of branded search clicks on Google Search Console for your brand, you can actually look at that period over period, right? Quarter over quarter, month over month, and see if more people are being driven to search for and click on your branded search results in Google. And that's a good way to understand if your brand marketing, if your marketing in general is increasing the overall growth of your brand awareness because those people are going into Google proactively and searching for your brand. And so that's a good lagging indicator and a good way to kind of see if you're trending in the right direction. Okay. One more question here from Simon. So what is the right level of sophistication regarding ML and MMM models, thinking in particular when inbound funnel is small? So very hard to pinpoint to what work and what doesn't. So what do you do when the volume is too small? It's a great question. When your volume is too small, if you've got a handful of leads or demos every week, MMM is absolute overkill. So I wouldn't do it. And incrementality testing might also be an overkill. And so at those really small volumes, what I would do is focus on channels where you can very clearly see the impact. So I'll give you an example. Simon, if you're talking about sort of handful of ICP demos, it sounds very B2B SaaS, but tell me if I'm wrong. And what you have to do is find a channel where your audience hangs out and make sure you have high awareness, high engagement on that channel. For me personally, I'll give you an example. I work at a company called Paramark. We are very much in the same bucket. We have low volume. And for us, the primary channel is LinkedIn. That's where people hang out. And so if people are hanging out, if my audience is hanging out on LinkedIn, then I want to be there on, daily, on a weekly basis. And I want to have content that is relevant for my ICP. And I want to see high engagement from directors, VPs, C-levels in the marketing function. And LinkedIn does provide all of the analytics for me to be able to see that on a post-level basis, both in terms of the impressions, but also in terms of the engagement. And that's a very good, easy way for me to understand if my marketing is actually, reaching the right people and is it resonating, right? Is it causing impressions? Is it causing engagement? And, obviously you'll be able to see when people come to you inbound from that channel, either through an in-mail or because, when you talk to them on the phone, they tell you that they saw you on LinkedIn. So for smaller volumes, I would take more tactical approaches, common sense approaches, but at higher volumes, multiple channels, you need more sophisticated type of measurement. Okay, we got 3 minutes left. Other questions? All right.
Yes,
Hello? Yep.
this will be recorded. I just wanted to answer Anita's question to the hosts and panelists. It'll be recorded and we'll be sending out the deck to everybody.
Fantastic. So remember, everything that we talked about today was an introduction to, these more sophisticated concepts like incrementality testing and marketing mix modeling. And I would highly recommend that you sign up for the Reforge course that's starting on September 30th. It's a 1 week long course, 3 deep dives, lots of interesting conversations with industry experts on a second level of detail on these types of concepts to get you to be more confident in your decision making with your marketing leaders, with your finance leaders, with your executive leaders. So until then, if you are curious, reach out on LinkedIn, hit me up on Slack. I'm in the Reforge Slack if you're there, and excited to answer any other questions you might have.